Hi guys, welcome back. I'm really excited about today's video because it's about one of my favorite films ever. Trainspotting is turning 30 this June and it's getting a 4K release, which I am extremely jealous of because it seems to mostly be happening in the US, like all things are. I don't think it's gonna be releasing in Romania, but I've been waiting for an excuse to talk about this film properly because this is not just a film I love. It's something I've actually studied in depth. I wrote my dissertation paper on this. I worked on it during my English degree, both the book and on the film. And it was overall just a very cool topic we discussed in our classes. Trainspotting is a film that stays with you and that stayed with a lot of generations. And I think that's exactly the question worth asking now, 30 years later. Why does it still resonate with so many people, even with those who have no connection to that reality? Why did it stand the test of time, and ultimately why did it become a cult classic? One of the reasons I've always found Trainspotting so fascinating is that it somehow managed to become both incredibly niche and incredibly universal at the same time. It belongs very clearly to a particular place and decade, and yet people far outside that world still connect to it immediately.
For a time, there was a sense in which you almost had the feeling of a studio promoting its own work within the country that the film came from, and promoting it in a way that said it's for everybody, this film. It's not for a niche group, it's not for the art market, it's not for a cult audience, it's for everybody who goes to the cinema, you know?
A lot of other films are too dependent on the period and on the context that produced them, and I think that's why they don't stand the test of time. So in my world, apparently all the roads lead to Scotland, and it's very important to note that this is a Scottish story, because when people think about British cinema, they think usually about England. More polished films, more heritage cinema, more controlled narratives, and Trainspotting does the opposite. It places Edinburgh in a completely different light than what we're used to, not the romantic, touristic version, but something more uncomfortable, and that mattered a lot for the time, especially for Scottish audiences, because this was the first time they actually saw something that felt like their reality on screen. So the film isn't just about youth or addiction, it's also about national identity, about how Scotland saw itself at the moment and how it positioned itself culturally. Trainspotting also became a turning point in British cinema generally. A lot of people described it as one of the first British films that generation had, that had the speed, swagger, and confidence of American cinema without losing its own identity. What Irvine Welsh wrote and Danny Boyle translated visually is something much closer to a study of identity under pressure. The addiction is there very explicitly, but it functions almost like a lens. Through it, you see a generation that feels disconnected from the structures around them, from class, work, and even national identity, as I mentioned before. And although released in the 90s, the story is set in 80s Edinburgh during a period marked by Thatcherism, economic restructuring, and a very visible breakdown of working class communities. There was also a real public health crisis at the time, with HIV spreading rapidly among intravenous drug users, partly because clean needles were not being distributed in a consistent or effective way. The context actually matters a lot because these characters don't exist in isolation. They are shaped by a society that is already fractured, and the film is very aware of that. The addict isn't presented as a singular problem, but as a symptom of something larger, of the societies it exists in. For example, the famous Choose Life slogan was actually a motto for an 80s anti-drug campaign, so Renter's refusal to choose life becomes more than just a rebellious gesture. It reflects a rejection of a system that, from his perspective, has very little to offer. His perception is that the version of life offered to him is empty, repetitive, and ultimately meaningless. Another reason this film still works is that it understands addiction without reducing its characters to it. It doesn't present heroin as some abstract evil descending out of nowhere, and it doesn't treat the characters as one-dimensional cautionary examples. A lot of films about drugs only show the consequences, which can make the characters feel flat, I think, because you never fully understand why they keep going back and why they keep doing it. Trainspotting is smarter than that. It knows that if the highs were not seductive, then the addiction would not make sense. So when people accuse the film of glamorizing heroin, I honestly think they are missing how carefully the film is working.
You can't keep going around saying, just telling people through the media, through art, you mustn't do drugs because they'll ruin you. Because there are a lot of people exploring them themselves to certain relative degrees of safety, you know, and I think that's one of the joys about the book, is that it tells you the truth about the other side. It doesn't flinch to tell you what can happen to you, but it also tells you just how extraordinary these drugs can be.
So the style is there to help us understand the attraction, but not to celebrate the outcome. And that complexity is important because stigma is part of what keeps addiction misunderstood. The film isn't asking you to approve of these people, it's just asking you to see them as people. You can also feel that this is a story about boredom and alienation as much as it is about drugs. The characters are already making terrible decisions and are already dissatisfied, so the addiction intensifies that reality, but it doesn't create it from scratch. And it doesn't create that emptiness from scratch. And I think that's part of why the film still resonates, even with people, who have never taken drugs. It just taps into a feeling that exists before the drugs even appear in the question. As I mentioned before, the film arrives in the mid-90s when British cinema is going through a shift. Investment is increasing, new filmmakers are emerging, and there is a growing interest in stories that feel more connected to contemporary culture. But even within that context, Trainspotting still feels distinct. British cinema had a strong tradition of social realism, especially when dealing with working class life. So films tended to present these realities in a very observational way. Trainspotting stood out because it managed to be politically charged without becoming heavy or didactic. It was clearly responding to social realities, class tensions, and the damage of Thatcherite Britain, but it never turned into a lesson. It had the confidence of something much bigger and glossier, but the soul of something fiercely local and specific. And that gave it a completely kind of cultural impact. It also bends genre freely. There is a constant play between realism and distortion. The word is recognizable, but it's heightened through color, editing, and perspective. Scenes stretch, collapse, or shift into something surreal, and that's where the film starts to build its own language. You have the worst toilet in Scotland sequence, which is a perfect example because it begins in a complete degradation, then changes into something dreamlike. That scene is also one of the clearest examples of how the film visualizes the irrational logic of addiction. From the outside, what Renton is doing is degrading and absurd, but from the inside, it becomes this beautiful underwater fantasy because all he can see is the possibility of relief. The same applies to the withdrawal scenes where the camera becomes unstable and intrusive. The viewer isn't observing from a safe distance. You're placed inside that experience. This approach is often described as black magic realism, where the real and the imagined coexist without clear boundaries, and it allows the film to move beyond representation and into sensation, which is one of the reasons it remains so impactful. Now let's talk about the soundtrack, because the soundtrack is almost always mentioned when people talk about Trainspotting because of the way the songs are used. The music becomes part of the structures. Some of these scenes are actually edited to match the structure of the songs, not the other way around, and that's why even now when you hear one of the songs, you immediately think of the scene it appeared in. The soundtrack also works because it maps out a whole generation of cool. You have Iggy Pop and Lou Reed bringing in the ghost of 70s counterculture, and then New Order, and then Blur and Pulp and other different artists. What's clever is that the film can move through all of these musical moments without making the characters feel like they have aged or shifted decades.
And what we try to do in the film is make it stand for a period of time running from kind of the mid to late 80s up to now, really. And we've tried to illustrate that not with signs going up saying 1987, but actually with pieces of music.
From the opening sequence with Last for Life,
choose life, choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a fucking big television.
The relationship between image, voice, and music is established. The rhythm of the song, the pacing of the editing, and Renton's monologue are all constructing meaning together. And that pattern continues throughout the film. You have the song Perfect Day. And what I love about it is that it captures the film's very dark sense of irony. The song is beautiful and makes the physical collapse on screen feel even worse because of that. But at the same time, for Renton, heroin really has become the thing that passes for a perfect day. So the irony is psychological and it tells us something awful about his inner world. There is also a historical layer to these choices. Many of these artists on the soundtrack, including Iggy Pop and Lou Reed, were associated with earlier countercultural movements, particularly in the 70s, so their presence connects the characters to a longer tradition of rebellion, of alternative lifestyles, and resisting mainstream values. At the same time, newer acts like Born Sleepy introduced the emerging rave culture and electronic scenes of the 90s, and the film moves between these musical moments, showing a culture in transition. Also, Born Sleepy at the end does something equally brilliant. It gives the ending this rush of energy and apparent liberation, but there is still ambiguity underneath it. Is Renton free, or is he simply swapping one dependency for another? Is he escaping, or just learning to function inside a different system? The music makes the ending feel euphoric, but the questions remain unsolved. You also need to take into consideration that when the first film appeared, there weren't discussions yet for a second movie to be made, so the ending makes sense because I don't think actually Renton wanted to change at all. There is also something very smart about the film using music to keep itself lively and watchable even at its darkest moments. Films about heroin can often be punishing and flat. Trainspotting never lets itself become inert. It stays funny without losing the seriousness underneath, and that's a huge part of why it became such a rewatchable film. Now let's talk fashion. One of the most interesting things about the film's fashion legacy is that it emerged from a world where style should not in theory have been the takeaway. These are addicts in cramped flats and rough environments, and yet the film ended up shaping the visual language of youth culture for years. That says a lot about how strong its image making really was. The costume designer Rachel Fleming essentially created a look that didn't exist in mainstream fashion at the time. The costume design draws heavily from punk and post-punk influences, but it doesn't replicate them. Like, they don't feel like costumes at all. At the time, much of youth fashion was dominated by rave culture, so loose silhouettes and a very different aesthetic from what she introduced. The film introduces something more defined, slim silhouettes, which means inventing skinny jeans, layered pieces, a mix of casual and fancy elements, and we all know Renton's very cunty cropped top, which has been imprinted in my memory forever. And then you have Diane's look in the club scene, that sleep dress, the red coat, that 90s energy. It became instantly iconic, especially for young women at the time who were very impressionable. If you didn't know, most of these looks were built from secondhand clothing, charity shops, and everyday materials. How cool is that? Because that made everything look so authentic. Each character's style reflects their personality. Sick Boy's tailored look, for example, references classic cinema like James Bond.
These images here, particularly to do with Sick Boy, who's obsessed with Sean Connery, with women,
which fits his obsession with image and control. Renton's look is more stripped down, more functional, which aligns with his shifting identity throughout the film. These choices, of course, contributed to the film's cultural impact in a very tangible way because it influenced literally how a whole generation presented itself. And a lot of what we now associate with skinny jeans and that kind of edgy minimalism can be traced back to this film. What often gets overlooked are the conditions in which this film was made. The rights to the book were difficult to secure, and there was a general hesitation within the industry about adapting a novel that was considered too much, and also linguistically challenging and commercially risky. But that resistance shaped the film in very important ways. The adaptation process itself meant simplifying the narrative structure without losing its energy. That meant the focus shifts more strongly onto Renton, creating a clear through line while still preserving the fragmented feel of the original text.
He's kind of the thinker. He thinks about everything, and we hear most of his thoughts through voiceover. Usually quite quiet in the background of the scenes, usually a bit distant from the rest of the boys. He's slightly more judgmental attitude about what they get up to than maybe they do themselves.
Casting was also crucial. The performances needed to feel lived in, otherwise the entire world of the film would collapse. The casting stories make that even more fascinating. Ewan McGregor wasn't the obvious Renton on paper, and Ewan Bremner nearly didn't want to play Spot because he already played Renton on stage. Johnny Lee Miller had to fully inhabit the Scottish accent to make Sick Boy not believable. Kelly MacDonald was a complete new face, which made Diane look so much better. And all of that contributes to the sense that the film is held together by these instinctive, risky, but very correct decisions. Location choices, production design, even the way scenes were lit and colored were all carefully calibrated. Looking at all of these things together, the reason Trainspotting has endured makes a lot of sense. Many of these underlying conditions, it response to haven't gone anywhere. Inequality, lack of opportunity, distrust in institutions, the sense that a whole generation is being asked to buy into a future that doesn't feel available to them, none of that belongs only to the 80s or the 90s. That's why the film still feels politically alive. What stays with you is that feeling of being inside that world, of understanding even briefly the logic behind it, and maybe that's also why the film keeps finding younger audiences. People may not share the exact historical context, but they recognize the emotional one. I also think the film benefits from the fact that it defies expectations. It's often remembered through its poster, its soundtrack, and its fashion, but when you watch it, what stays with you is actually how sad and psychologically perceptive it is. It gives you coolness, nausea, comedy, and grief all at the same time. So yeah, that's my take on Trainspotting. Of course, we could talk about this film for hours, but I think that's enough for now. If you've watched it, I'm curious about your take on it and why you think it's still relevant after 30 years. And if you haven't, please go watch it and let me know what your expectations going into it were and if they were defied. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye!